Well, here we are again. Let me get my computer set up here. But we are in Esther 7 and 8. And so wish you well on this day. We'll pick up where we left off. Last we saw Haman and Xerxes had been invited to happy hour. And if you remember right, Esther, I felt that Esther, whether quickened by the Spirit or however, felt that it wasn't time to actually say what she wanted to say. And so she was willing to put it off a day. And some things happened during that day, in which one of which was Mordecai was paraded around town by Haman. And so that kind of gave you an inkling of where things were going. And the last we saw was that Haman his wife had kind of said some things, and we'll talk about those as well today, had said some things kind of last minute, like, this isn't looking good for you. And so they're invited to what I'll call the dine and dash gathering number 2. So happy hour was gathering number 1, dine and dash is gathering number 2. And so without further ado, let's see if we get my mouse working here. Mouse work, there we go. Verse 1, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." And so this is the third time we're seeing this petition and request. Petition, what is it you need? Request, what do you want me to do? And I actually have, and I may have shared this with you before. I apologize if I have, but it's kind of followed me in my prayer life as to what is it I need, Father, and what is it I want you to do? Because when you start to put it in those terms, you're kind of exposed to whatever. If it's a selfish prayer that I've got, it's automatically exposed when I say it in that form. This is what I need. This is what I want you to do. Kind of flushes out some prayers pretty quick. So I don't know. It's an interesting format because we see this happen throughout Esther, the petition and request. What is your need and what is it you want me to do? And again, the king offers up to half the kingdom, so she could rule alongside the king if she wanted to. But this is the point where the story makes an absolute turn. And so, verse 3. Then Queen Esther asked and said, "If I have found favor in your sight," and we know she has, "O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me as my petition." That's what she wants. She wants her life. "And my people at my request." That's something you can do, king. "For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." And so, once again, like I said, Esther, I think it was Esther 2:15, talks about the fact that she's got a gift. Whoever sees her finds favor, and so we'll give her favor. All right, so that's it. Now, something escaped me. I don't know if it escaped you or not, but I thought Esther was going over the top. Because she says she uses 3 terms: destroyed, killed, and annihilated. And I looked them up. Destroyed means to be brought down or exterminated. Kill means to be stricken with the intent to slay. And annihilate means to be led away to perish. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you. And I'm like, Esther, you're going over the top with this verbiage. But what I didn't realize was all Esther was doing was repeating Haman's law. That Haman's law was to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. I mean, there was death, certain death, and certain death. I mean, it was. I thought it was over the top, but like I said, I had not paid attention to Haman's original order. All she was doing was summarizing exactly what Haman had published. So I missed that. I don't know if you missed it too, but I missed that. There's a little thing there, and you have to understand, if you haven't been following me at all, I come up with theories They are my theories and my theories alone, and I have no theological credentials other than a child of the King, and the Spirit resides in me. His Spirit resides in me. But I have conversations with my father all the time, and if you've listened to any of my past teachings on Esther, I had a theory that Esther's pregnant, and I have no proof for that whatsoever. It's just a theory. It's the manner in which she speaks and some things that she says. I've been led to believe that perhaps she's pregnant. And one of them is right here. So she says, the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So had we been sold to slavery, you wouldn't have heard from me. However, it would have been your loss. And so to me, that goes back to my theory about Esther being pregnant, because that's one of those things. Okay, so yeah, you're going to lose your queen had we been sold to slavery. Okay. But the king, it would have been something more particular to you than losing me. And that's where I kind of think. So once again, my theory and only my theory alone. But I thought that little comment that's tucked in there in verse 4 gave a hint that there's something personal that would affect the king if Esther was led off to slavery. Anyways, verse 5. Let me get a drink of water first. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who would presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. All right, so I want to focus on the presume in his heart there for a second, but I got to back up because I have a military background, as if you know me, you know that. And I used to be an electronics technician long ago and far away, on F-14s. And so F-14s back then, they're no longer flying, but the military has IFF. You have both an interrogator and a transponder. And IFF means identification friend or foe. And so it comes in various modes, and the F-14 had an interrogator. But all military aircraft have a responder, and that would be our heart. But I need to explain that to you. So a transponder, you had modes 1 and 2, which identified your mission. I think mode 3 was something that you selected in the cockpit so that air traffic control wanted to know where you were. They could give you some particular squawk that you could squawk. But the one I want to key in is on mode 4. Mode 4 specifically said whether you were friend or foe. And so using that kind of analogy, I want to make the connection between a identification of friend or foe with our heart. Because here we have Haman's heart. Well, the king asked, who would presume in his heart to do such a thing? So he's kind of going right to the heart. Is this person a friend or foe? Because you have to keep in mind our words. And let me back up for the transponder. Transponder was keyed every single day. That was one of the things I did as an AT. Is you key in the correct code that says I'm a friend. Every day that had to be updated. And so our heart reveals that code that's set into our heart. Jesus said it in Luke 6:45. He says, a good man out of the treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasures of his heart brings forth evil. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So whatever you say kind of reveals what's going on in your heart. It'll tell you what the code has been set in your heart. And you have to understand, our heart, our originally issued heart, is not compatible with God's Spirit. Okay, and it talks about in Ezekiel 36:26. It says there's a need here for that change. If we want a heart that identifies as friend, we have to get a new heart. And Ezekiel 36:26 says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And so in order to be identified as friend by God, we need a new heart, because the heart is the heart which is what identifies us as friend or foe, as we're kind of learning here with Haman. Haman's heart was identifying him as a foe. And so how do we get, once we get that new heart, it's God's Spirit inside us that identifies us as friend. If you go to Romans 10, verses 9 and 10, it says, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So keep that in mind. Your heart identifies you as friend or foe. And here, Haman's heart had identified him as foe. Verse 7. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? So here we see the king, when he finds out what Haman's done, he's angry and good for him. He steps out, maybe to get a hold of himself, get a hold of his anger. He steps out. But you have to understand, the king's not innocent in this whole issue. King, he's not as guilty. There is a plausible deniability that the king has, because if you go back and you look in Esther 3:8, Haman was super vague in explaining to this king. He says, this is what Haman said to king. He says, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed, doesn't say the Jews, among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom, and their laws are different from all others. Once again, doesn't say the Jews. And they do not keep the king's law. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. So nowhere does Haman actually say, king, we're going to go out and kill all the Jews. So there is plausible deniability that the king has. He's not totally guilty, but he's not totally innocent too. And that's the thing too. When he leaves, it doesn't really say whether he was obviously mad at Haman, but he might have had some inner issues going on too. It's like, I knew I shouldn't have signed that. I shouldn't have given that to Haman. And the verse continues, and as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So I was looking at that. There's a connection between the word leaving the king's mouth and his face being covered. And at first I was like, okay, were they just removing the trigger? But I was thinking about it, and I think the face covering goes with judgment, and judgment comes via the king's word. And so this is the point of judgment for Haman. Judgment is about to be executed upon Haman. And so I was looking at Haman's life. It's like, this is, when you are judged, your life will be, reviewed, so to speak. And so the first thing you got to keep in mind about Haman, he was born under a curse. As an Agagite or Amalekite, he was born under a curse. And I've talked about this earlier in Exodus 17:14. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount in the hearing of Joshua that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. So he's born. There's a curse that he's going to be destroyed. It's just born under a curse. But interestingly enough, some messengers have been put in place to remind him of his sin. And Mordecai happens to be that two of the occasions. His wife was the third occasion, where he's kind of reminded that where he's going is not the right direction. Esther 3, verses 5 and 6, when Haman saw Mordecai, he was filled with wrath. And so there was his pride was exposed. And so, interestingly, it was Mordecai Mordecai is not doing anything. He just refuses to comply with Haman's pride and arrogance, and so just refusal kind of mirrors back to him that at that point Haman should have. I mean, I don't know, and that's what's the cool part. When we have God's Spirit in us, God's Spirit in us will help us reflect and convict us of the sin that's within us. But Haman had an opportunity there to actually do some reflection as to what was going on. Why was he so angry? He not only happens there, but it happens again in Esther 5:9. Once again, Mordecai refuses to submit to his pride and arrogance, and so consequently makes him angry there. And then the last one, the third time that he was kind of convicted of his sin, or not convicted, but had the ability to reflect back on his sin, was when his wife, just when we were closing chapter 6 there with his wife, he had gone home after the parade, and that should have been the big one right there, with his head covered. And his wife says to him, "You will not prevail against Mordecai if he is in fact a Jew." And so, anyways, there's three opportunities that Mordecai had to possibly turn things around, and all three of them he didn't. And you have to keep in mind, we are called to be the messengers to intervene in people's lives, the people around us, to help remind them that they need to surrender. In Matthew 5:15, Jesus said, "Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, that it gives light to all who are in the house." And so I think that's part of the thing that we're called is to be a light in the world. And one thing with light tends to expose darkness. And so, anyways, that was kind of an interesting little segue there. Anyways, verse 9. Now Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high." This is Judgment, by the way. 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. And so, first off, here's another theory I had. I told you that my theory was that Hathach, who was, it's like back in Esther 4, verse 5, Hathach, who was assigned by the king, he was a eunuch assigned by the king to watch over Esther. He's the one who interfaces with Mordecai. So that was my theory back then, that if he's working for the king, but in the service of Esther, that whole conversation that took place with Mordecai should have made its way back to the king. And in my theory is, if that's who you serve, I mean, that's who writes your paycheck, then that's who you report to. And perhaps it's just the military in me, knowing that you always, whoever has command over you, you always report back to them. And so I'm assuming that's taking place. And that was where I kind of put my theory that Hathach's information would make it back to the king. And I think I see this here as a fellow eunuch is reminding the king of Mordecai's honorable actions and Haman's ill intentions. And so kind of supports that theory. So whether that's true or not. But the thing I wanted to key in there is when when Haman was hanged, then the king's wrath subsided. And so there's and just to refresh your memory in case you missed the previous ones, the Persians had the way they executed people, even though the New King James translates that hung, and gallows, the way they executed their people was a little more vicious than that. They put them on a spike, and it says here 50 cubits, which is 75 feet tall. And I'm looking in my backyard, and I have some like 100-foot tall trees. And so it's kind of hard to imagine up there somewhere, and here's what they did. You got this 75-foot tall spike, and they basically impale you on it so that it comes out next to your neck. You don't die immediately. It's a long, screaming process, but it's a bloody, nasty. I don't even want to think of that. But the execution of Haman made the king's wrath subside, and it's like the Haman's blood satisfied the king's wrath, and so it kind of reminded me too of that there's a connection between blood and wrath in the Bible, in particular between blood and God's wrath. Blood is required to satisfy God's wrath, and that's something we need to take serious. That's something that we need to, that people need to understand who aren't saved, is that there is wrath coming based upon sin, and there is a way to satisfy that wrath without giving up your own blood. And the first one is Hebrews 9:22. It says, "And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin." And so if we want to get rid of our sin, blood has to be shed, okay? That's the only way to do it. Well, Romans 5, verses 8 and 9 says, Jesus' blood satisfies God's wrath. It says, verse 8 says, "But God demonstrates his own love towards us, and that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having been justified by his, much more than having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath through him." And so that's kind of an interesting point there. It's just as Xerxes' wrath was satisfied by the blood of Haman, so is God's wrath satisfied by the blood of Jesus. And we, by accepting lordship of that, are saved from that wrath. Verse 8. And I'll talk more about that as well at the end here. Or I'm sorry, chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Mordecai's got getting a huge financial and political promotion right here. And so Esther's financial windfall, which had to be substantial because Haman was willing to pay for the slaughter of all the Jews throughout the entire kingdom, which is huge. It's from Ethiopia all the way to India. This is a huge kingdom. And if he had the money to pay for that, Esther just made a whole bunch of money. And Mordecai is going to be charged over that, to have charge over that. And so there's a new sheriff. Mordecai's a new sheriff. And one of the things I like about this too is Mordecai was unaffected by the parade that had previously happened. He didn't have a sudden influx of pride or whatever, and so he's kind of proved his character. And so this huge political and financial windfall that he just incurred, I don't think is really going to affect him at all. Verse 3, it says, "Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter." I'll get back to that in a second, because notice she spills the beans and then he holds out the scepter. So hang on for a second. "And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, 'If it pleases the king, if I have found favor in his sight, and the things seem right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes,'" which we know she is, "let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Okay, so first off, keep in mind, because of verse 9, we know this is 2 months later. But this little says, now Esther spoke again to the king. This is 2 months have passed. And so she still doesn't have guaranteed access to the king. She still is under the I don't know what the word is, threat of death if the king doesn't grant her access. So she's kind of coming before the king and spilling the beans. And it was one thing I missed, and I went over this with my wife, and she pointed that out. And I'm like, how did I miss that? You have to keep in mind is that there's an issue here that really Esther doesn't explain it here, but if you look back at Daniel too, it helps you understand a little bit more. The Persian kings, and I'll read the verse from Daniel 6, verse 8. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. So the adversary had, in Haman had been removed, but the law is still out there. The threat's still out there, even though Haman's still there. And here's the deal: it can't be undone. And Esther doesn't really say that, but it can't be undone, which which the king knows this, and it's going to be resolved. She wants to get it undone, but it can't be undone. It's out there. The word has been put out on the streets. Preparations are already beginning. It's been 2 months, so preparations are in full swing for the execution of the Jews. And Esther's doing her best at this point to undo this. So notice here too, she announces basically her petition and request prior to the king granting her access. And if you look down at verse 7, we'll see Mordecai's with her. So she burst in, but she goes in. She announces her petition and request. Mordecai's with her, and then the king grants her access. And I honestly think, and this goes back to another one of my theories. So you're seeing why I had some of my theories, because these are some of the little things that I've kind of backed them up as I've studied through Esther. I've kind of like, this over here connects with this over here, which connects it with this over here. And so Mordecai, if you go back to Esther chapter 4, verse 14, it says, this is Mordecai speaking to Esther, if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And so he had kind of spoken this, I don't want to say prophecy, I don't know what else to call it, but he puts this out there that if you don't do this, you and your father's house will perish. So I think, honestly, this had been weighing on Ruth. This had been weighing on Esther to the point where this is kind of like her last real push to make sure that she was put there for a time such as this. This is kind of like it. Okay, I've come before you before to kind of bring this to your attention. Now I'm coming before you again to get it undone. All right? But as I just said, I kind of spilled the beans a little bit. It can't be undone. It's out there. So verse 7, then the king Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name, sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. Okay? So the king's scribes were called in that time the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews, the satraps, and the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province to its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of the king, Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. Okay, so Mordecai has the king's authority to write a new law. Okay, but once, like I said, it's already been several months, and the enemy's already had time to prepare. And so initially, I thought this is kind of an unfair. Enemy's got an unfair advantage. You know, the enemy has been out there and prepping, and God's people are way behind the power curve here. If they're supposed to, you know, this new law is going to be written about the Jews, and quite honestly, it's a defense law. You know, there's a law to kill the Jews already out there, and now Mordecai is going to write a different law. These guys, the enemies of God's people, are going to have the ability to kill the Jews. Now that there's a new law saying the Jews can defend themselves. Okay, so this is kind of setting up this interesting battle, which when we get to chapters 9 and 10, we'll see the outcome of that. But I thought it was an unfair head start. And whenever I think about the enemy having an unfair advantage, I think of David. In Psalm 118, verses 10 through 12, he says, all the nations have surrounded me. But I love David's heart. But in the name of the Lord, I will destroy them. They surround me. Yes, they surround me. But in the name of the Lord, I will destroy them. They surround me like bees. They were quenched like a fire of thorns. For in the name of the Lord, I will destroy them. So here's David. He's, you know, that whole spirit of David of being the underdog, yet full knowledge of who your father is. They surrounded me like bees. I thought that was interesting too. I had to look up what it meant by they were quenched like the fire of thorns. And David kind of gives you a picture there that's kind of interesting. I mean, thorns, here in the Northwest, we have to deal with blackberry bushes, which are just terrible. But if you've ever burnt blackberry bushes, they burn up and the fire's bad, but they extinguish to nothing. There's like nothing there. I mean, if you can somehow get a bush, you know, set on fire, there's nothing left. And so it's kind of, it's a real threat, but it will be extinguished by fire. And it's a short fire. But anyways, I love David. So there is an unfair start. You know, as David said, all the nations surrounded me. They surrounded me like bees, you know. But I also think that, and David, once again, I'm going to go back to a song on this, Psalm 23:5. David also kind of points out the fact that by the enemies doing what they're doing, it highlights who the enemies are. You don't have a question, okay, you know, all these people, they look of the same nationality, the same, you know, ethnic background. Which ones are my enemies and which ones are not? Well, the people who are preparing for the destruction of the Jews have just highlighted themselves as the enemies of God. Psalm 23:5 says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. And so there's no question as who the enemies are. The enemies of the Jews and the Jews are very much now, they know who each other are. And I thought this was interesting too, as a historian. It says from India to Ethiopia. So the only civilization that's kind of left out of this is Greece. I mean, because Greece, this is prior to Roman Empire. So when you go from India to Ethiopia, it's pretty much most of the world. I mean, Greece is a tiny little dot over there. But this includes wiping out enemies in the Promised Land, which I thought, you know, was interesting as well. So verse 11, by these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and to protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate. There's that verbiage again. all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. Remember that when I'll talk about that. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So those who were scattered abroad are now allowed to gather together. Now you kind of keep in mind, it makes it sound like man scattered those, and the king allowed them to gather together. But you have to understand, we talked about this earlier in Esther. It's God who scattered God's people, and it's God who gathers them together. So this is not something Ahasuerus is doing. This is actually part of God's plan. Ezekiel 36:19 says, "So I, Yahweh, scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed among the countries. I judged them according to their ways and their deeds." And then if you look at Isaiah 11:12, it says, "He will set up a banner for the nations, and will assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." And of course, that's talking about other times. But God is the one who disperses, and God is the one who calls us to gather. And I found another interesting thing too is that there's that whole thing of the enemy planning evil, and it's going to turn out for good. Genesis 50:20 says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about as it is this day, to save many people alive." And I think that was Joseph in Egypt, but I think that was kind of to do. So it's kill, destroy, and annihilate in order to protect themselves. And so, we keep talking about in politics of the Great Reset. This is the Great Reset. This is wiping out the enemies of God's people throughout the Persian Empire, which is vast. And I'll come back to this when I cover chapters 9 and 10 when we wrap up Esther. They are allowed to plunder their possessions. Okay, so keep that in mind. They are allowed to plunder their possessions. All right, and once again, I think, quite honestly, I've said this probably 4 or 5 times in the teaching of Esther. I honestly believe this is the fulfillment of Esther is the fulfillment of Exodus 17:14. I just read it earlier when the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalekite from heaven." I think this is it. And so anyways, verse 13, copy of the document was to be issued as a decree to every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed by the king's command. The decree was issued in Shushan, the capital. Okay, so we've got this calendar ready, and the king's horses being sent out kind of authenticates the message. And so, verse 15. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and the decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now, this is interesting, because there's still a pending battle coming. You know what I mean? It's still, there's still a pending battle coming. However, it's interesting too. If you go back and you look at Esther 3, chapter 3, verse 15, you'll see, okay, Shushan, which is the capital, there's a change in the mood, because back then it said when the couriers went out, this is when Haman's order was issued. And the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Shushan was perplexed. So here we see Shushan rejoiced and was glad. So there's a sense in the land that, yes, there's an impending battle coming between the enemies of God and God's people. People are okay with that. It's kind of and oh, by the way, God's people had light, gladness, joy, honor, a feast, and a holiday. And once again, there is an impending battle coming, and the people have light, gladness, joy, honor, a feast, and a holiday. I'm like, I still haven't got my arms around this one here too. I'm still doing a lot of processing on this, but I think it's an interesting thing that as we close chapter 8, there's joy in the land, and there's salvation. Many of the people of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Yeah, that's interesting. But all this to say, and I'll end with this today. The king's word stands, Xerxes' word stands and can't be broken. And there's an old command that requires a new command to provide protection. The old command has to stand, and in order for salvation to come, a new command must be issued. Does that sound familiar at all to you? It's like when reflecting back upon this, it really rings with where we are. The law condemns us. The old commandments, the Old Testament condemns us. Romans 3, verses 19-20 say this. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. So the old commandment condemns us. The Old Testament, I'm not saying the Old Testament in its entirety condemns us, but the law which is in the Old Testament condemns us. We're all guilty. However, there has been a person in history who has fulfilled the law, because that's what is required by God for salvation, is fulfillment of the law. Okay? There is one person who's fulfilled the law, and that's in Matthew 5, verses 17 and 18. It says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot and one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled." So Jesus fulfilled the law. And if we want to be covered, and this is the New Testament, this is the new law, if we want to be covered from God's wrath of the old law, we have to surrender lordship to Jesus, and that basically protects us from the penalty or the wrath of God. And that's in Romans 10, verses 9-13, that if you confess with your mouth Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For the scripture says, whoever believes on him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon him. For whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And that's what I want to leave you with today. I want to leave you with that knowledge of there is a way to escape the wrath of God. There is a way to not have to worry about the condemnation that comes with the law, with the old command. All right? So leaving that out for you. Tune in next time and we will wrap up Esther, and then I'll tell you where we're going to go next. God bless and take care.